everyone. I'm Keith Mathis with the Mathis Group. Today we're going to be talking about vendor management metrics. Do you work with a vendor? Are you trying to hold them accountable? Are you trying to work with them within the contract? We're going to talk a little bit about that today and look at some metrics of how you can hold a vendor accountable within their contract and be able to benefit you, the customer, to be able to get exactly what you want from and out of that vendor. One of the things that's always a challenge is the issue of metrics. So we're going to talk specifically about metrics in this section. Auditing metrics. Anytime you hire a vendor, you're going to be bringing them in under contract. You have certain jobs you want them to do on that project. Well, one of the things you must do is think through how are you going to measure whether or not the vendor is doing what they say they're doing. So auditing metrics must be customized and created for each project being examined. Metrics must be specific and quantifiable if they're going to measure the level of performance of any project. And what this means is you've got to decide what is realistic. What is the realistic level of metrics and what is a realistic level of achieving that metric? So if you're going to measure certain things, you've got to determine how are you going to collect the data to know whether or not that vendor is doing what they say they're doing. Here's some reasons for metrics that will help us. It allows us to compare performance to the baseline. It provides benchmarking comparisons. It provides all participants the opportunity to understand how the project or service is performing. It is a measurement for holding vendors accountable. Now, I'm a vendor in 99% of the cases. So a lot of times people will say, well, why are you talking about this? Because many times what happens when you'll hear from many of the clients how they're so frustrated with a vendor of how that vendor's not performing or they're not able to really measure that vendor. And so some people will say, I don't even know what the benefits of metrics would be. Well, normally, if that's our feeling, we've got wrong metrics. So it allows us the ability to compare performance to the baseline. So the first metrics that we have to do is understand what the baseline is. Now in PMBOK tells us that we baseline at the beginning of execution, and from baselining until the end of that project, nothing happens without going through change control. Now, if you're working on a project and your vendors are not baselining anything, they're not baselining the schedule, they're not baselining the cost, or they're not baselining the scope, then what's happening is that's going to be too loose. So you want to make sure that this project gets baseline so that you can measure against performance. Also, it allows you to be able to look at where are we doing good, where are we doing bad, and what can we do to help. You're not trying to be an opponent to the vendor. You want to be a support to the vendor, but you can't do it unless you know exactly what's going on. And also, you want a metric that's going to hold the vendor accountable. And it has to be more than just they've got to be there on June 15th because the contract says June 15th. Sometimes there's reasons why June 15th was not reachable. And sometimes it's the vendor's fault, and sometimes it's the customer's fault because of how and what we communicated. So there's got to be some reasons for the metrics, and we need to make those reasons good reasons for why we're collecting what we're collecting and collect the right stuff. Types of metrics that many people collect: time, budget, schedule, customer satisfaction, deliverables, and success factors. Now, time, budget, and schedule are already pre-built into projects. And sometimes that's the only thing that anybody else is measuring is time, budget, and schedule. But if would tracking deliverables make a difference with your group? Would customer satisfaction make a difference with your group? Would success factors make a difference? For an example, in customer satisfaction, if we're working in an agile project, time, budget, and schedule are important, but customer satisfaction is paramount in working in an agile environment because the customer is driving that scope and the customer is driving which features are worked on continuously. So the type of metric can make a huge difference in what we're measuring and the success we have. So for an example, if you've got an internal best practice, let's say, of how you guys do project management, and you want that vendor to interact with that process, because I hear this from time to time, and that vendor's not doing it, make sure that was part of the contract, that the vendor had to comply with the best practices of your organization rather than you complying to the vendor, if that was a big deal. Now, I'm not saying it's a big deal. It might not be. But if the vendor's doing a lot of the work on site and interacting with a lot of your people, your best practice might be better than the vendor's best practice. Now, if the vendor's doing 100% of the project off at their location, then obviously don't mess with their process because that's their internal process. But that's what I'm talking about. Which metric are we going to be measuring? How are we measuring success? So here are some other metrics that come up: milestones, contract goals, work product delivered, operational service, business value, productivity, cost, quality, business value, cost performance index, schedule performance index. Now, two of these are very important for you to use in project management. Over in the right-hand corner, you'll see cost performance index, also known as CPI. You will also see schedule performance index, which is also known as SPI. CPI and SPI is a great tool for you to measure any vendor with. And the reason is because they're bringing you back the percentages, and you're measuring these percentages compared to other percentages that they have delivered in previous meetings. So CPI and SPI, and so in a nutshell, here's what that is. It's showing the cost efficiency. It's showing the schedule efficiency of what's been accomplished compared to what was planned. So in the SPI and CPI, it's going to be a percentage. And it's going to be 1.00 is going to be perfect. If you're below 1, that's going to be bad. Not horrible, obviously, in some cases, but bad. So let's say we had a 0.85 on our schedule. That means I'm 15% behind schedule. If I have a 1.05 schedule, that means I'm 5% ahead. So understanding how to interpret CPI and SPI, with 1 being where it should be perfectly, and so above 1 is good, below 1 is bad, and then what happens is you're able to interpret these indexes from the vendor, and you can have the vendor deliver those to you. And so, in other words, if the vendor is constantly giving you 1.00 week after week and meeting after meeting, that's hot air, because that's not how a project runs. It will drop down into 0.94 to 1.02 and bouncing back and forth. So don't be ridiculous. Don't expect them to always deliver 1.00. It's going to fluctuate. But at the same time, it does give you something to be able to see whether or not something could be having a problem in the future. 3 types of project delays happen with a vendor, and some of these are going to be on the customer side, and some of these could obviously be on the vendor side. The first one is excusable, the second is non-excusable, and the third is buyer-imposed delays. Now, what you get into here is excusable. You understand that we've gotten behind. In some cases, it's excusable because we found something that we didn't know was there. So let's say, for an example, you are overseeing the project at one of the power plants, and they're doing maintenance, and you've got a vendor in there doing the maintenance. And when they open up the section in the power plant, you discover that there is a flaw to the turbine that generates power. Well, nobody knew there was a flaw. Nobody anticipated that. That was not part of the original project. And so now that you know it's there, now you're having to create change orders to be able to take care of that. And it's going to delay the project. It was supposed to get done June 1st, not going to get done until July 1st. And so that might be excusable because of what we found out. Non-excusable is that we're just flat out behind on the schedule. That could have been because we didn't do a good job in estimating the schedule, either us or the project, the vendor project manager, or just because we're not working as hard as we should. And so there could be that. And then you could also have buyer imposed. Buyer imposed means that the customer has put stipulations. For an example, you're working on a project and all of a sudden something drastic happens at that company. Many years ago, we were at an organization, and 2 people in the organization were killed in a car crash, and they were very high up in the organization. And so everything kind of went on hold for about 10 days while they were reshuffling, trying to figure out what they were going to do, because these were high-profile people, very much involved in a lot of different projects, and these individuals were just flat-out good people. And so the people were reacting and grieving over the loss of this. So the buyer imposed a 10 days to where the projects, everything just kind of stopped, and they let people just kind of sort through it so that they can, within 10 days, they were able to kind of come back and get going again. But it did delay the project, so that was buyer imposed. Excusable delays, those which are not considered to be the fault of the vendor. So excusable could be severe weather, strikes, fires, floods, terrorism. I mean, think about what it would be like to have been in Washington, and maybe you were there during the time when all of that anthrax started showing up at all the government buildings. It didn't matter what kind of project you had. That building was evacuated, and evacuated for weeks, in some cases maybe even months, before it was actually cleaned up and fully available for you to come back in. So I don't care what project you were working on, that project probably saw many delays just because of those type of things. But there are excusable delays that happen on our project. Nobody wants it, nobody votes for it, but we kind of inherited it because of just the circumstances that we're in. Non-excusable delays, those which are considered to be due to vendor failure or negligence. They're looked at as being under the control and power of the vendor. Bad planning, procrastination. These are the things that you're wanting to be able to get a heads up on by using the vendor metrics prior to this. And here's the reason why. If there's a problem with the vendor, you're wanting to know earlier rather than later. You're wanting to know how bad is before it gets to a point to where all of a sudden the vendor is in default and you're scrambling to come up with who is going to be the next company that finishes this project. So you're wanting to have something to trigger you to be able to know there's a problem before you find out from the vendor there's a problem. Buyer-imposed delays take place when the buyer extends the project. You'll normally see this through a bona fide change request. Penalties and costs might still be associated to both sides, but the delay has been driven by the buyer, not the vendor. Now, if it's a legitimate change request and an extension, those are normally acceptable, but it does impose delays as to what was anticipated in that project in the beginning. Contract modifications. Contract modifications normally take place within the any type of project based on a change order. But contract modifications might take place within a project. The contracts normally have a detailed provision of how contracts will be modified, what process they must go through. And so obviously if there's a change request and if it was a fixed price type of contract, you're going to have a contract modification. Now if it was cost plus or time and materials, that contract modification is not going to be there, because in a cost plus or cost reimbursable contract, that allows more flexibility to where the vendor is going to be paid in cost, and then of course the type of contract is going to make a difference on the vendor's profit. So there's nothing to really modify. Time and materials are in the same boat. Time and materials, you're normally paying by the hour, and so what happens is it just means more hours for that vendor. But if you're in a fixed price contract, you will find yourself using that tool and having to change that tool to accommodate the change orders that the buyer is wanting to instigate. Two types of contract modifications: unilateral and bilateral. Unilateral contract modifications requires only the procurement or contracting officer to sign off. Usually when you see a unilateral contract modification, it's because of some kind of paperwork or administrative problem. Misspellings, administrative change, suspensions. There can be a lot of different things. Could be the change of some personnel who would be the contact people. It's normally administrative, and so this is not something that's stopping the contract or the project. It's just paperwork is really what it is. However, you also have bilateral contract modifications. This requires the procurement and the contracting officers as well as the vendor representatives to sign off. Now, your organization might not use the term contracting officer. It could be the customer project manager or the sponsor or the PMO, but the point is they're functioning as that contracting officer. And so this means that we've had enough of a change that we're having to put an amendment into the contract or change the contract. Normally, you'll see this happen when you have expansion of services or product or new directions or new technology. For example, if you're doing a technology project that was 4 years old and you're working in this, in that 4 years, there's technology that's going to be invented that you did not know about when you started this contract. And so those adjustments there to use the newest technology is going to make a lot of sense in a project such as that. So bilateral contract modification is going to make a huge difference because you're then going to turn around and add the requirements to that new technology as part of this project. Two types of contract termination. There's one, termination for convenience, and termination for default. Termination for convenience, circumstances changing for the buyer surrounded the contract. Now, an example of this can be something as simple as they put you under a contract, put the vendor under a contract, but they don't need them because someone else, the new boss that came in, decided they're not going to go in that direction. And so what happens is it's termination for convenience, meaning that's not going to become a project. Termination for default, the vendor has defaulted in some area of the contract. That means the vendor did not provide what they said they would provide. That's the default that you're looking at. Termination for convenience provides a process for terminating a contractor and relieving your organization from any liability in the future. Normally has specifics the contractor had to violate which were serious enough to terminate the contract, but in many cases, termination of the contractor for convenience, nobody violated anything. The vendor didn't violate, the customer didn't violate, they're just not doing the contract. Circumstances for termination for convenience. The following events can lead to termination of a contract with the vendor. For example, bankruptcy or financial hardship. A contractor is unable to perform services in the future. Requirement changes which are outside of the contractor's expertise. So you can find a lot of different things that can be termination for convenience. Also, a service or a product procured is no longer in demand, or products or services are outdated or obsolete, and you can see that in technology. That happens very, very quickly. Also, the vendor is in some type of default of the desired contract. Then obviously, if they're in some type of default, that can lead to termination for convenience, but it can lead to other types of termination as well. Contract disputes. The disputes in project management have become huge in the courts, and PMI has decided in the PMBOK 6 to really speak about these particular things. For example, litigation, arbitration, adjudication, mediation, and conciliation. As you look at the contract disputes, what you're trying desperately to do is not go to court. You're trying to be able to work things out with the vendor and the customer so that each of them is happy with the end result of what's going to be chosen. Once it gets into court, what happens is everything gets slowed down, and even in many cases, the project gets stopped for 3 years while it gets through the court system. Litigation. This dispute is settled within a court system and overseen by a judge who has authority by the city, county, state, or federal court system. Facts are given at a hearing by each side, and the dispute will be settled. Now, litigation means that somebody has sued. You had to get into court, everybody's got a lawyer, and it's going to be heard by a court system. This is one of the longest things that you can possibly have in trying to settle a dispute in a project. And so you see projects stop for years while they go through the court systems, and that's not what you're wanting to have happen. Arbitration. This is chosen as a means of arriving at a decision from the arbitrator rather than a judge. Arbitrators are normally industry specific. They hold to a detailed code of confidentiality of the event. But an arbitrator, many times the background of an arbitrator could be that they're a lawyer. It could be that they're a judge, a retired judge. A lot of times they will do this as during their retirement because it's going to be very short-lived. But the arbitrator normally has a lot of industry specifics in this as well. And so once again, the arbitrator makes a decision, and so they give a decision to both sides. It's going to be much faster than going to court for litigation. Adjudication. This allows all parties to represent themselves and evidence can be presented. It might not follow the entire legal process, but it's cheaper and it's quicker. Now, the adjudication, all parties are able to represent themselves, which means they're getting in there cheaper because they don't have a lot of lawyers involved in trying to do this. Both parties present their sides, and then you normally will have an impartial person who will do their best to try to get the two to come together and get to be able to talk through this. Mediation, it's a method where a third party will look at the agreement and make recommendations. This individual is impartial, works to get a compromise. Now, mediation is even a softer approach. They are a third party. They don't have really any power over either one. They're not making a decision. And so what they're going to be doing is they're going to be making recommendations to both groups. And that recommendation is listened to because they're trying to walk out of that room with a compromise. And so both parties are going to be listening to that mediator to be able to come up with, here's what I think would work. Here's the right type of recommendation and the right type of offer. And so this can be very beneficial for both sides. The other is conciliation, and that is used when there appears to be a very strong legal issue facing the situation. Legal issues will be discussed and a possible settlement will be reached and documented for a legally binding agreement. However, they didn't go to court. This is like what we would say they settled out of court for this amount of money. So conciliation means that one party is agreeing to pay another party X number of dollars, and this allows the project to be able to move forward and to be able to stop any other legal issues associated with this. Let me thank you so much for watching the video today on vendor metrics. If we can help you in any way, contact us at themathisgroup.com or the 800 number. We'd love to be able to work with you. We do on-site training 99% of the time. So we can bring a PMP boot camp on-site at your location, or an Agile boot camp on-site at your location, or one of our 45 different project management classes. We can bring those on-site and have instructor-led face-to-face right there at your location. If we can help you, you let us know. Have a great day. Bye now.